proceedings of the Education Select Committee in our accountability hearing with the Secretary of State for Education and the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education. Welcome to our committee this morning. Secretary of State, I believe that you would like to give a couple of minutes of introduction. Can I encourage both members and our witnesses this morning to be succinct in both your questioning and your answers. We have got a great deal to get through, and we have a hard stop of around about 11:45 to enable members to get to Prime Minister's questions this morning. You're very welcome. Over to you, Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll endeavour to do that this morning. I'm delighted to be here today, and I do want to say before I go further how proud I am to be in front of you. There is no job better in government, no better select committee to sit on, and I also want to thank you, Chair, for the early opportunity to update members of the committee on the work and thinking of the Department for Education. This government believes that education belongs at the heart of national life, at the heart of our ambition that we have for the next generation. And I know how a great education can, and support of loving families and parents can transform lives. And my ambition and determination is to improve standards at every stage of children's education. I believe that is the way we will drive the best possible outcomes for all, breaking the link between background and success. That starts in our children's earliest years, and our plan for change sets the ambition for a record proportion of children starting school ready to learn. And this step is essential to every child's success. Turning to schools, over the past few decades, we saw improved attainment before the pandemic, but all was not well in our school system. A third of children were leaving primary school without all of the fundamental reading, writing and math skills, disadvantaged children too often being failed, and children with SEND left without the support they needed to excel at school. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated those problems, and recovery has been too slow. Average attainment is down, the gap for disadvantaged children has opened up, and we have an absence crisis with more than 1 in 5 children missing a day at school each fortnight, fuelled by fewer and fewer children feeling that they belong at school. This needs to change. Our mission is to drive high and rising standards, and academies are crucial partners and often leaders in this. High standards must be the right of every child, delivered through excellent teaching and leadership, a shared knowledge-rich and engaging curriculum, and a system which removes the barriers to learning that hold back too many of our children. This means higher and broader expectations for all children and of all schools, and that truly means for all children. We are designing a school system which supports and challenges all schools to deliver high standards for every child. Expert qualified teachers in every classroom, teaching a rich and broad curriculum, with schools able to create an attractive paying conditions offer that attracts and retains the staff our children need. We will create a floor but no ceiling, enabling healthy competition and innovation to improve all schools. But effective competition alone isn't sufficient. There are still too many struggling schools that are not providing a good education, with a fragmented system that lets vulnerable children fall through the gaps, and we will tackle this. Our accountability reforms will replace blunt single-word judgments with more information on what schools do well and what they need to do to improve. Our new RISE teams will work with schools that are struggling or slipping, and we will continue to change the leadership and governance of schools where there is not capacity to drive the change that is needed. We are taking action to make sure that parents, wherever they live, will have a good local school for their child and can be confident they will achieve and thrive. But learning must not end when young people leave school. We are going further to create new pathways for young people and adults to learn, retrain, upskill throughout their lives, spreading growth and economic opportunity to every corner of our country. And I look forward to discussing this and all issues with you this morning.
Thank you very much. We are going to start with some questions on the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, which is a hugely significant piece of legislation, a very large bill. I want to ask first of all about the unique identifier for children, which is a critical measure at the heart of the bill, and a lot kind of hangs on its implementation. Can you say how the unique identifier for children will be integrated with existing databases and information systems, and how you will ensure that data accuracy and privacy is maintained during the implementation?
Yes, of course, and those are the right questions to be asking, and I know that people want to be confident around data security and how this will work around appropriate secure governance. That's why through the pilot areas that we'll be bringing on board, we will make sure we can test all of this and ensure that information is being shared in a way that is completely appropriate as set out in the legislation. I think just slightly going back a step, this is something that's been called for a very long time, including by children's charities, the Children's Commissioner, because as things stand, there is a lot of information that's out there in the world about children, that where we bring it together, we can have a much clearer sense about what's going on in a child's life. And I think that is especially important for our most vulnerable children, where we know from all of the work that's gone on over many years, the reviews, serious case reviews, that sometimes the failing is agencies not sharing the information that is known about a child's life, and only through putting that information together can we really make sure that we're putting in place the action that's needed to protect children and to keep them safe.
Do you have a timeline in mind for the implementation of the Unique Child Identifier?
Yeah, so the intention is to bring pilot areas on board by April 25, so to start that process then through that testing, in understanding that we have the design and the information sharing in the right place, we can then look to timelines around how we take it forward.
Thank you. And can I ask now about profiteering by children's home providers? We've heard from a range of different witnesses, some concerns not about the principle so much as the delicacy of the implementation and the need to ensure that local authorities have ample opportunity to transition to different types of provision, and so that there isn't a kind of collapse in the provision of children's home places for children. How are you going to ensure that in implementing a cap on profits, you don't inadvertently cause a collapse in the provision of places for vulnerable children?
That tension is the heart of the approach that we're taking in seeking to make sure that we do shift the system, but alongside that we don't further destabilise what I appreciate is quite a difficult situation for lots of children and young people at the moment. So the legislation brings in the ability to set the profit cap. We would want to consult further on the shape of that, but the message to providers is clear that we think excess profiteering has no place within the system, and we want to work with local authorities and others to put in place the capacity and the places that are required to ensure that where children's social care placement is the last resort, the only option for a young person going through the system, that there is high quality, good local provision that is available. That's why alongside the measures that we're setting out around the introduction of the profit cap, we're doing more on kinship care and fostering and early support too, because I believe that there is so much more we could do to put in place earlier and timely support for parents and for children to stop problems escalating. But where social care placement is required, it should be of the highest quality. We do need to act on the excess profiteering in the system, but that has to, alongside it, involve market shaping to make sure that we are creating the provision that's required.
And are you looking at the provision of transformation funding for local authorities to enable them to deliver, whether that's in-house provision, whether that's working with trusted providers who are not profiteering, to make sure that the places are available in residential care?
Yes, absolutely. And I've seen some fantastic examples of local councils doing precisely that across the country. Through the budget, we did invest more capital into it, but I appreciate there is more that we will need to do over time alongside this legislation to get that balance right within the system of care for children.
Thank you. I'm going to Caroline next.
Thank you. Nearly 500,000 children are missing out on free school meals that they are eligible for, and we know that that then means that many schools are missing out on thousands of pounds of pupil premium funding that they could get. So could you tell us what the reasons are for not including auto-enrolment of eligible children in free school meals in the bill?
We continue to look very carefully at this right across government with other colleagues. What we are setting out in the bill, as you will know, is the starting the process of rolling out breakfast clubs in all primary schools. I believe it is really important that children get a great start to the day. I understand the arguments that are made around auto-enrolment, and we continue to look carefully at that.
We can see it's been successful in many councils. So is there a timeline for looking at when you're looking at it? But what does that mean?
Yeah, I can't give you a timeline on it. What we are doing at pace, as you'll know, is starting the process of rolling out breakfast clubs in primary schools. The early adopter scheme will come on board this year, which will start to make a really big difference to children's lives.
Yeah, we know about breakfast clubs, but I was asking you about free school meal auto-enrolment. Is there any plan to roll that out?
As I say, we continue to keep this area under review.
Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for your answers so far. So I absolutely welcome the creation of registers to monitor children not in school. What projections, if any, has your department made on the costs that local authorities might incur as a result of the creation of these registers?
Yes, absolutely. And we are mindful of the challenges that local councils are under at the moment. It's why through the budget we did invest record levels of funding into councils to make sure that they do have more resources, particularly in targeted areas like this. All of the measures that we've set out through the bill have been cleared by Treasury, are consistent with our baseline. And to the point around children not in school registers and why we believe this is such an important measure, and this goes back to the discussion about the single unique identifier, there are too many children where we just don't have visibility as to what's going on in their lives. We need to know where children are. I think alongside that, the measures in the budget, the measures in the legislation around ensuring that where there are serious concerns around safeguarding, where Section 47 investigations are underway, that we require parents to seek the consent of local council so we can be absolutely confident that we're protecting children's best interests.
Okay. And in addition to that, I know that your department and you have no problem with parents who then choose to homeschool their children. That's not what this is about. It's about keeping children safe. I've met with homeschoolers in my constituency and they have concerns about the security of the data. So what reassurances can you give them that this data won't be able to be accessed by anyone and what will happen to it after they stop being children?
Yeah, and to be clear to your constituents and to other parents who choose to home educate their children, if they are doing so to a good standard and they have their children's best interests at heart, as I'm sure that they do, then they have absolutely nothing to be concerned about in the measures that we're setting out. This is about making sure that where there are concerns about a child's welfare, that we're seeking action, that we're making clear that we want to know where children are. I would say that we will ensure alongside that there are clear safeguards around data sharing and information. Local councils are aware of their duties under various legislation already in place. There will be a responsibility to follow that through. And that would include, for example, provisions around how long data and information is held for, which would be the case across all aspects of information and data control.
Oh, yeah. And just finally, Chair, is there any guidance or is there going to be any guidance how to standardise this process across all local authorities so you don't end up with hundreds of local authorities taking different approaches to data collection?
We will make sure that councils have the clarity, the understanding and the consistency so that we do have a clear and uniform approach across the country.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jess.
Thank you, Secretary of State. The bill strengthens Ofsted's powers to investigate unregistered and therefore illegal schools. Last week, Ofsted officials largely welcomed the changes, but said they looked forward to conversations around unregistered alternative provision, which does not get as great a mention in the bill. Why is unregistered alternative provision not included in the same way as unregistered schools?
Yes, as you say, we are taking action through the bill that we have discussed with Ofsted to make sure that they have the powers that they need. I did look carefully at what Ofsted have said to the committee, and I have regular conversations with Ofsted about the powers that they require. We won't hesitate to go further to make sure that Ofsted are able to intervene to make sure that children are kept safe. That's a conversation that we continue to have with Ofsted, but of course there are always limitations to just how much you can bring forward at one go.
Thank you. And you mentioned the important need to tackle profiteering, but one of the measures that the bill introduces is an expansion of regional care cooperatives. Could you explain the evidence which sits behind the decision to expand the regional care cooperatives when similar regionalisation arrangements for adoption agencies hasn't really increased adoption places significantly?
I think on that latter point, I think the picture is slightly mixed and a bit more nuanced in terms of some of the evidence. I think I have seen good examples where collaboration between local authorities on fostering has been more effective in providing that clear one-stop shop for those who wish to become foster carers to know where to go rather than having to contact lots of different agencies and those responsible. On the regional care cooperatives, I think there is a strong evidence base behind councils working together more effectively in order to provide provision within their areas. Often, again, some of those, the quirks of geography can mean that you can end up with some perverse consequences where councils don't collaborate and work together. I think the long-term intention of the policy change overall is that we see fewer children having to go into formal placements through children's social care, through the changes that we drive around kinship and around fostering. But alongside that, where it is necessary for children to require placement within children's residential care, for example, that they are much closer to home. I have seen far too many examples of children being sent the length and breadth of the country, far away from family and friends and support networks, having to move education provision, and the outcomes, as you will all know, for children going through the children's social care system are quite frankly a national scandal. And that's why we are taking early action to put in place the support that is needed for some of the most vulnerable children in our society who too often don't have a voice and whose needs have been overlooked and forgotten for far too long.
And next, given the horrific murder of Sarah Sharif and recent calls by the Children's Commissioner and children's organisations to equalise protection for children, as is the case in Scotland and Wales, do you think it is now time to introduce this protective measure, particularly as we have a Children's Wellbeing Bill in front of us?
I understand the arguments and the case that is made for it. It's something I have discussed directly with the Children's Commissioner and others. It's an area we'll continue to keep under review. I want to look at the evidence that emerges from Wales and Scotland, but we have to be absolutely clear that children must be kept safe from harm, that parents do have responsibilities, and the changes that we want to put in place are around ensuring that problems do not escalate, that families get the early, timely support that they need, but we don't intend to bring forward any changes in the way that you've described.
Thank you.
Patrick.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I want to ask a question about Clause 45, the extension of statutory pay and condition arrangements for teachers in academies. As brief as you can, what was the thinking behind the decision to tighten rules on pay for teachers in academy schools?
Yeah, we want a solid floor for all teachers working across the profession with clear expectations about what it means to be a teacher so that every school has the freedom to innovate and go beyond. I think it's become clear to me there's been some confusion and some worry about what I've said in this area. So today I want to be absolutely clear that all schools will have full flexibility to innovate with a floor and no ceiling on what that means, because we all know the challenges that schools across the country are facing at the moment around recruitment and retention. But that innovation, that flexibility, that excellence, much of which we have seen within the academy system, I want to be available to all schools. They do brilliant work, especially where it comes, I think, to some of the changes that we will need to see to make teaching a more attractive place, especially for those seeking to combine work and family life. Not least because what troubles me is that we see growing numbers of women, particularly in their 30s after having had children, deciding that they find it too hard to combine being a teacher and being a parent.
Okay, so just in terms of what you've said with regards to schools have flexibility to pay a teacher more than what the STRB recommends outside of the band? Is that going to be the case?
A floor and no ceiling.
Okay. So what is the intention? Is there a lot of evidence that teachers are paid significantly below in academies? I'm just interested in why the inclusion of this clause. Is there any evidence that head teachers do pay teachers less than they would do otherwise if they were bound by the STRB?
So I think it's a combination of how we want to approach the wider package where it comes to being a teacher. So it's about pay and conditions together, not just one or the other. And I think lots of what I will hear from teachers across the country is, yes, there have been challenges around pay, although we did deliver the 5.5% pay award for teachers coming out of the last STRB process. But some of the biggest challenges are around flexibility and how we make teaching a really attractive place for our best graduates. Now, I've seen some great work, including within academies, driven by fantastic leaders, that has allowed innovation and flexibility. However, I want that innovation and flexibility to be available to all schools, regardless of type.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to move on with Darren, please.
Good morning, Secretary of State. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, issue facing families, children, professionals is special educational needs and disability, and how we best care for and get the best for those children. You've set the direction of travel as inclusivity in mainstream, and first down payment of that, obviously we've seen £740 million of capital investment. What follows that? What are the next priorities to improve that inclusivity in mainstream?
Yes, absolutely. And I think right across the House there is a recognition, and right across our country when you speak to parents and schools and others, that the system that we have at the moment just isn't delivering the good outcomes that we want for children with SEND, where parents have increasingly lost confidence and where councils are increasingly being pushed to the brink. We did invest more through the budget in this, and I'll return to that, but precisely on the question around inclusivity in mainstream, we've set up work within the department. I've brought in Tom Rees, the who leads a large academy chain who does fantastic work in this area, to give us early advice on the short and medium term changes that we can make within the system to drive more inclusivity in mainstream. But I do need to be clear that I think the reform that is required goes beyond that. I think the scale of what we face in terms of the challenges that families and children are experiencing at the moment. It's why there is much more that we need to do around creating specialist provision for children within mainstream. Again, some fantastic examples that I've seen across the country, but that had been against the grain of previous government policy rather than in line with government policy. So we'll be setting out more this year on the direction of travel, but through the budget, an extra £1 billion going in to support for children with SEND, additional investment around capital. But this is a complex and challenging area in terms of the longer term reform that I believe is required. I think it will require all of us to think differently about the kind of system and support that we want for all children. And children with SEND have, I believe, been forgotten for far too long. And that's why one of the first things that I did on becoming Secretary of State was to restructure the department to put SEND right at the heart of what we do around school life. Because if we want all children to succeed and excel at school, that has to extend to children with SEND as well.
This committee heard from Sir Martin Oliver of Ofsted last week that they intend to bring in measures to look at what inclusivity means and make their judgment partly based on that. They will obviously need a framework from the department so that they know what they're looking for. What's your intention around how you monitor and measure progress of whether schools are becoming more inclusive or not?
Yeah, we'll be saying more around that very soon in terms of the new Ofsted report cards and the approach that we take from the department around accountability. But I think there is a lot more that needs to happen around inclusivity. I'm also very alive to what I hear, what I'm sure you will all hear from teachers and school staff across the country, about how they often feel ill-equipped to support children with a growing range of needs. So I think there is much more around training and development for our workforce, support staff, as well as teaching staff, in order to drive more inclusion. But I also want to be clear that we do need to protect and maintain good provision and good places in the specialist sector for children whose needs cannot be met within mainstream provision. That will always be the case. There is also amazing work that happens across the specialist sector. I think there is lots that they can show us and help us with in terms of what that could look like within mainstream as well.
Just quickly on capital funding, are you looking at the specification for new school buildings and school refurbishments to make sure that that is an inclusive specification, and that there won't be school buildings that are built in the future that need to be retrofitted to make sure that they can accommodate the broadest possible range of children's needs?
Yes, absolutely, both through the wider capital programme of the department and alongside that the additional investment that we intend to put into creating more specialist provision. We might come on to this point, but there is obviously a wider demographic shift that's taking place across the country, first here in London but soon to be elsewhere, that will mean we have spare capacity within many of our schools. I think there is a question as to how we use that space more imaginatively to allow for children, wherever possible, to be able to go to their local school, because that's what lots of parents will tell me they want. They want great provision for their child, but they would love that provision to be much closer to home.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. As somebody who was teaching on this day a year ago, I know just how creative teachers can get when it comes to approaches towards children with SEND and how to make them feel included, especially in mainstream settings. Now, some have suggested that the best way to improve inclusivity in mainstream settings is to legislate for it, is to put it on a statutory footing. Is that something your department would consider, and if not, why not?
We are looking at whether legislation might be required as part of any reforms that we intend to bring forward, and we believe that we would have the time available to us should that be required. But I think, if I may, I think that slightly gets ahead of the thinking that we have underway in the department. I think we just need to take a step back from the system that we have inherited, a system I believe that has been neglected for far too long, where children have been failed, where we have had high expectations for some children, but not all children, and that has to shift. So I do believe we need to think differently about where we are and where we need to get to so that all children can achieve and thrive, and that we recognise, as we see a larger number of children in mainstream settings who have additional needs, that becomes, much more responsive, and the teachers in particular, I think, as you describe, have the tools, the training, the development that they need. I hear a lot of the time that lots of teachers feel that they just don't have it, and a more complex cohort of young people than might have been the case previously.
Oh, absolutely. That is definitely the case. And you talked there about having to take a step back and look at the entire system, not trying to get ahead of ourselves. So I wonder, has your department looked at any alternative systems? Have you looked at other countries to see what works there? And is there anything that you're considering implementing from those other nations?
Yes, we have. I'll return to that in just one moment. I'd just say I appreciate the committee has work underway in this area. We do look forward to seeing the work that arises from the committee and understanding what what you might be able to share by way of approach and recommendation as a part of that. But I'll turn to you, Permanent Secretary, just on the international evidence.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, we have looked at international examples, and I know that the Chair has been quite interested in examples like Ontario, and that is one of the places we've looked at. We've also looked at the Irish system, particularly looking at those systems where there is successful work to support that mainstream integration, because that delivers better results for children, not actually just children with special educational needs. I mean, one of the things people sometimes worry about is that if you provide more inclusive education for children with special educational needs, might you drag down the experience of other children? And actually, when you look at it, the international evidence suggests the opposite, that actually it's better for all children if you can provide better, more inclusive education. The other thing we've been doing is using the evidence base and working very closely with health partners on programmes that help to support teachers in their teaching. So I just pick out 3 programmes that I think are very relevant. So again, the committee will know that the fastest growing areas of need are around speech and language, social, emotional and mental health need, and ASD. We have worked with the Department for Health on a programme called Partnerships for Inclusion of Neurodiversity in Schools, the PINS programme, and that deploys specialists from both the health and education workforces to train school staff and give them really high quality resources. And that will have worked with around 10% of mainstream primary schools by this March 2025. It's early days, but the results from that programme look promising, and that is the sort of approach we would like to roll out further. We also have the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, NELI, one of my favourite education acronyms, which is focused on improving speech and language skills of children aged between 4 and 5, and that has worked with over 200,000 children. It's actually screened over 640,000 children and then worked with 200,000. And again, the evaluation of NELI shows that it improved the development of oral language skills by 4 months for pupils receiving the intervention and by 7 months for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then the third programme I pick out is LSEC, Early Language and Speech for Every Child, which is looking at different workforce models to support the early identification of children and young people with speech, language and communications needs, again, in the early years in primary school. So trying to start early, identify early, and put positive interventions in place. So we're looking internationally, but we're also looking domestically at how we grow and spread best evidence on the approaches that work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Manuela,
Yes, just very briefly, in rural areas in particular, you might have mainstream schools with very high quality provisions, but they are struggling to recruit and retain teaching assistants, for example, which obviously support the work and the work with SEND pupils. And I wonder whether you're thinking about, you could look at looking at teaching assistants into a career path with continuous professional development to make the job attractive for the people to come and send the pupils and schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is about the whole workforce, so that extends to our teaching assistants and support staff as well as to our teachers. It's why we're legislating to restore the school support staff negotiating body to make sure that everyone within our workforce is properly supported. Alongside that, one of the interventions that the Permanent Secretary was just talking about there, the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, much of which will be delivered through our teaching assistants and support staff. There is a challenge around making sure that the brilliant people that do so much of this work have got the training and the professional development that they need. I think there is also a question around routes into teaching for support staff, for teaching assistants who might wish to consider that as well. We're looking carefully at it. But I think it's around those career pathways, the onward progression. But alongside that, I do think the teacher direction and integration of those two approaches, so having teachers who are really expert in how they can deliver interventions for children with SEND, but supported by the workforce who again feel valued and respected for the work that they do. It's why such an important part of what we've sought to do since the formation of this government is to make absolutely clear that reset between government and the workforce, because everything that we're talking about today around life chances for children, about high standards in our schools, about breaking that link between background and success, we know that the quality of teaching in particular is the single biggest way that we can make that shift.
Amanda.
Thank you. In 2020, there was the introduction of the statutory override, but despite that, 2022-23, there were 101 overspent local authorities on their high needs budget. It's obviously contributed to the cumulative deficit in the dedicated schools grants, or the DSGs. And many local authorities are concerned about the economic viability after the statutory override comes to an end in March 2026. And would like clarity about whether the override will be extended or what will happen if that's not the case. And so, question on that, but also just why has there been a delay in the decision making, and when can local authorities expect an answer?
I do recognise the pressures that councils across our country are facing, pressures around children's social care, around support for children with SEND, and much more besides. We do recognise that strain, and as part of the local government funding, the local government finance settlement in December, the government set out plans for reforming this, for making reform. There is more that we need to do. I can't, I'm afraid, give you a timeline at this point as to when we might be able to say more, but we do appreciate the need to put local authorities on a more sustainable footing and to consider the statutory override as a part of that. And we'll continue to work with councils to keep the sector updated as much as we can do, as quickly as we can.
Just to press you on that, Secretary of State, so the Public Accounts Committee report that was published overnight, last night, calls for the government to decide what to do about the statutory override no later than March this year, in light of the fact that local authorities are required by law to set balanced budgets. They have to do that in light of the context at the time and not speculation about what might happen in the future. Yes. They will be setting budgets with a view to making significant redundancies over the coming year if there isn't clarity about what happens at the end of the financial year. Yes. So can I just press you again on when local authorities, who are in absolutely desperate straits at the moment on this issue, will have clarity about what the government intends to do?
I completely recognise the challenge and the urgency. We're working across government. This is not something that we alone can do. It's a cross-government consideration. But the inheritance that we have is one where councils are facing incredible financial difficulties. I understand that. It's across government. There are really significant fiscal challenges too, arising out of the inheritance that we have as a government. I don't know if there's anything you can add by way of timing.
Yes, I mean, just to say, we really recognise that timing and the urgency for councils in setting budgets, and we're working really closely with MHCLG and the Treasury, and we'll do this as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, my question's already been answered by Susan. So in terms of talking about programmes that can be implemented within a school setting to support children with SEND. So my follow-up would have been, why are we still trialling programmes? The evidence on Nellie's been well established for years. There's a point here which is, why is it not being rolled out universally across schools? And why is there not a capital allocation issue here where we're spending a lot of money on capital and buildings and boosting inclusivity, where money would be better spent on rolling out programmes with a good evidence base?
We are rolling out Nellie across primary schools, but I would say much of what you just said there, I recognise, but I'd probably direct you to ask previous ministers why they did not enough in this space, because they didn't.
Well, that's in terms of everything you've come forward with so far has been talking generally about capital investment. You're saying you're rolling these things out, but you haven't really made significant announcements. There's no inclusion within the Children's Wellbeing Bill that there's going to be a massive investment in programme delivery at the grassroots. So we're just going to leave it there, or are you going to come forward with more spending commitments in the near future?
There are areas where primary legislation is required, and I think an area where we do need to take action is around issues on admissions, which will help in this space as well. But what you're describing, and I agree that there needs to be more support for children with SEND, does not require primary legislation. And that's why we are rolling out the Nellie scheme. It's why we are rolling out more support for teachers. It's why we're working with colleagues in health on the short and medium term changes that we absolutely do need to make in the system. But I'm afraid I don't believe just tinkering around the edges of some of this will be adequate given the scale of what we face. But I do just have to really set this out very clearly. The inheritance in terms of not just the fiscal challenge, which I think frankly is second order, because this is about children's life chances, is shocking. I mean, we have let down so many children and families in our country. The families who have lost confidence in the system, the children who are not getting the outcomes that they deserve. So nothing's off the table in terms of what we consider around what reform will look like. But yes, in the here and now, we are rolling out Nellie. Speech and language support is a crucial area, I absolutely agree. And if we can do more to get involved in children's lives, where they're facing early speech and language difficulties, not only can we start to turn that around, but also we free up provision for children's needs who are more complex.
Thank you. Caroline Bowden.
Thank you. Secretary of State, what impact assessment has been made by the department on the impact of VAT on private schools for families who are choosing to send their child to a private school that's not named in a child's EHC plan?
Yeah. So as part of the changes that we set out with Treasury in the budget, and Treasury leading on the change where it comes to taxation changes, there was a full impact assessment. We did consider the needs of children with SEND. It's why, as a part of that process, where pupils require places alongside arising out of an EHCP where that need has been defined, there will not be any additional costs as a part of that. Now, of course, parents, in addition, are free to choose where they educate their children, whether that's in a private school or within a state school. But the line that we have drawn is that where that will apply for children who have an education, health and care plan.
Okay, so many families are waiting a year or more for a plan and are choosing to put their child in a private setting so that they can get some education in the meantime. So there's been no impact assessment done on parents who just make that decision without having the plan in place. Is that correct?
No, all of this has been considered as part of the measures that we've set out. What I would add, however, is that I do recognise that some parents will make choices around a private school if that's what they feel is in their child's best interests. And it demonstrates the urgency of the change that we need to drive across the system. However, that is beyond the means of the vast majority of parents in our country. The vast majority of children in our country go to state schools. That's why I am so focused on driving up standards across our state system for all children, and that does extend to children with SEND as well.
Okay, and could I just ask what impact assessment has been made about the impact of the VAT on private schools on the SEND capacity in state schools, if those children are then removed from private schools and put into the state system?
As part of the process through the budget around the changes that we're setting out, we've looked at all of the potential impacts, including on the schools themselves, on the potential for movement of children. But I'm afraid, we do have to be clear about where that is through an identified need, where it has been defined that a child requires a place within a specialist provision because their needs cannot be met elsewhere. There will be no additional costs. But of course, parents will be free to make a choice as to whether they elect for a private school for their child if they believe that's in their child's best interest. And I recognise that. Parents are, of course, free to make that decision. I just don't believe in what is a very, very constrained fiscal environment that we can continue to provide tax breaks in that way.
Thank you.
Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. So I should say I have 3 children who are independent schools. In the explanatory notes for the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, it says the primary aim is that the educational system should be more consistent, which is interesting because consistent can be consistently good as well as consistently bad. And certainly consistency has been achieved so far by the government taking away the Latin Excellence programme, delivering Latin to children in a whole range of schools, by cancelling the computer hubs which offer children an opportunity to go to a school that specialises in teaching computers and provides excellence in teaching in those areas, and by cancelling the language hubs and defunding those as well. So can you explain how, I can see how that improves consistency, but how that improves excellence and the floor with no ceiling?
I'll come on to the point on excellence because that is at the core of what I believe. We have had to make some very difficult decisions about what we can and can't continue to fund. That was sadly because of the legacy left behind by the previous government. To give a further example, we did seek to prioritise, for example, a pay award for teachers because we know that the quality of teaching is the single biggest way that we can make a difference to children's life chances. And the last government, unfortunately, received that report and made no provision as to how they were going to pay for it. So we have had to make difficult choices, none of which are easy. But alongside that, I do believe that excellence should be for every child. In every school, in every corner of our country. That is not currently the situation that we have at the moment. Far too many children, particularly children from disadvantaged backgrounds, are being terribly let down by a system that is just not delivering the excellence that they deserve. And what parents across the country want is a clear set of expectations around what all schools will be required to deliver. It's why, for example, I do believe that the national curriculum should apply in all schools. That, after all, was a Conservative achievement to deliver a core set of expectations, a floor, but where absolutely schools should and can and will go beyond it in order to give a brilliant education for all children. I saw in my own childhood what happens when schools fail children. I was very fortunate. I also had a loving family who really valued education. But for lots of the kids that I grew up with in the North East in the 80s and 90s, working class kids whose families were really struggling, they were terribly let down by a system that just wasn't working. And it was some of those changes, whether it was around the national curriculum, whether it was around assessment in primary school.
If I could interrupt the Secretary of State, just to come back to the question, I also grew up in the 80s and 90s in the North East of England, as she did, and went to a state comprehensive school until 16. So I understand the system as it was then. That's a long time ago. What I'm interested in now is how cancelling these programmes in Latin, computer science and languages is going to improve excellence for teaching, and particularly the children who were receiving those programmes.
Yeah. Again, I'm afraid I do have to return to the point that I made at the start around the really tough choices that we've had to make that we don't want to be making, but I'm afraid that was the inheritance from the last government. And to return to the point around what excellence and consistency means in that context, this is about innovation for me, it's about excellence. It's around those core set of expectations, I think, where there has been agreement over a very long time as to what is required, whether that's around curriculum, around firm and clear accountability, and around making sure that we've got a good sense of what a child is or isn't achieving within school. That is how we drive up standards, alongside a brilliant and supported workforce. On the specific point around, for example, Latin Excellence, that scheme sadly was due to conclude later this year. We're working closely with the Centre for Latin Excellence to ensure that schools involved in the programme will have access to the resources that they need in order to continue to deliver the programme. And as someone, again, who went to a state school in the 90s, we were taught Latin. This should not be the preserve of just those in private schools. I absolutely agree that I want all schools to be able to offer a broad and rich curriculum, including through a range of subjects. And that is the focus and the determination, not just of the legislation that we're setting out, but also the prioritisation of spending within the department, which is challenging, but we absolutely are focusing on driving up standards through investment in regional improvement teams, for example, and much more besides.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And I also learnt Latin at a state school in to GCSE in the northeast of England. So we have some things, as I said, we have more in common than we think. Wanted to ask about the effects of the VAT. We've heard about children having to move schools, including some children having to move schools during their GCSE or A-level year. We've heard about the closure of some schools and the unemployment of staff and contracts provided to them. And we've heard of some children who, having had to leave a school because parents can no longer afford it, struggling to find a school place for their children with a disruption to education as a result. Does that worry you, Secretary of State?
I want all parents to make choices about what's right for their children. As you will know, the vast majority of parents in our children elect to send their children to a state school. Now, that's a decision, but it's also a conscious decision. And I think our state schools do absolutely amazing work. But it's also a reflection of the fact that for lots of parents, private education is just way beyond their means. The average of £18,000 a year, I'm afraid, is way beyond. I will return to your questions. I'm afraid £18,000 a year on average is way beyond the means of most of the people that I represent, and I suspect most of the people on this committee. I do understand the questions around impact on children and young people, and that's why in the assessment that's set out, both the assessment ahead of the election but also the assessment that's been undertaken by Treasury subsequently, we believe the impact to be minimal. Of course, private schools are private institutions that can set their own levels of fee, they can make decisions about how they manage their budgets, how all of this stacks together. And I would hope and expect that schools in those situations will be seeking to bear down on costs to parents to make sure that they are available to their communities that they wish to serve. But their fees have gone up year on year, way beyond inflation, and they've frankly priced themselves out of the market for lots of middle-class parents.
I'm not sure that answered the question, Chair.
I think the Secretary of State said what she's going to say. I think we're going to move on to Serena. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Last week we met with Ofsted's Chief Inspector about reforms, particularly moving from single-word judgments to a new style report card system. How confident are you that the new report card system will not simply repeat the same high-stakes system?
The intention of moving away from the single headline grades and moving to a report card system is to make sure that it has two purposes. Firstly, to make sure that we have a much clearer sense as to what's going on within a school, what's working and what isn't, with a sharp focus on the change that is required to drive up standards. But alongside that, parents having a really clear sense of what's going on within their child's school at the moment. I think as a parent, if you were to read reports, you don't always get a really clear sense of what is happening and the change that is required. But I think I should be clear to the committee that this will not be an easier system for schools. It will be a clearer, firmer process that I think will give a much sharper focus on how we can ensure that schools are driving up standards across the system.
I was just going to amplify that and say it is a high-stakes system. It should be a high-stakes system because it's high stakes for children. So I think it's about it's the work that we've been doing in the department has been led by ministers, has been on the basis that we want, and with Ofsted, has been on the basis that we want a system that's higher information, more granular, more precise and more rigorous, not that it should be lower stakes.
Okay then. We were also told by the Chief Inspector that an annual Ofsted safeguarding visit to every school would cost £45 million a year. Will Ofsted be leading the annual safeguarding reviews, and if so, what will be the financial implications for Ofsted?
So in part it depends what that safeguarding review would consider and how big in scope it would be. Those conversations are underway at the moment as to the shape of that and what is required. I do think it's important that on a more regular basis we have a sense of these really important issues around, for example, attendance, off-rolling and wider issues of safeguarding within our schools. And just to return to the prior kind of point around the purpose and nature of inspection, accountability, what it's for, I think all of us would want to have absolute confidence that problems and issues are being identified as quickly as possible. I think the challenge at the moment is that in too many schools those issues are not being identified as quickly as they should be. Parents should not have to wait for that to happen, and that's why through the wider reform that we want to drive, both through the department but also working with Ofsted, is how we have a much clearer, earlier focus on schools that are stuck and are struggling. Because I just don't think it's good enough to allow these things to drift, and we won't hesitate to act and to intervene, because we all know that children only get one chance through their education at school, and we have to intervene as quickly as we can where that isn't working. Now, yes, it's about the support to improve, but we do need to maintain that clear view, I believe, that if things aren't working, we have to act in children's best interest. There is, of course, a balance to strike in this, but I think a focus on children's outcomes, on standards in schools, is where this all takes us back to. And I think what parents want and their frustrations about the system at the minute and how it doesn't drive that.
The reforms of Ofsted are also being undertaken in the context of Ofsted being named in the inquest into the tragic death of Ruth Perry, and that's where the reference to high stakes judgments come from, because that inspection had a devastating, catastrophic impact for that head teacher, and we know that those impacts are widely reported from amongst the profession. The Gilbert Review referred to a defensive and complacent culture within Ofsted. How confident are you that reforms that are underway internally within Ofsted are addressing the culture change as well as the changes in practice that you're seeking to deliver?
Yes, and I would just want to start by paying tribute to Ruth's family for the work in this area. I've met with Julia Waters on many occasions to discuss the family's awful, traumatic, devastating experience and the impact it has had on the wider community as well. I think what that identified is, yes, that there are changes that are required through the inspection process by way of report cards, but yes, that wider shift so we can be confident that there is consistency in terms of inspection outcome. This is something I've discussed with the Chief Inspector on many occasions around the wider reform that is taking place within Ofsted, around the quality of inspection, around how they need to do more, and they recognise this, to have inspectors with expertise in the relevant phases, around the training that is available to inspectors, something I know that they have taken action on following the inquest findings and many more areas. But I think it's absolutely right that yes, we make change around report cards, but the wider shift that Ofsted are leading in this area, and yes, I am confident that they are doing it. Of course, there is always more that is needed. I think particularly in terms of how they can recruit more brilliant school leaders in particular into inspection, which I know has been a challenge in recent times.
Thank you. We will go to Caroline Bird.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd just like to talk about the national funding formula. So schools in Devon, where I come from, with 1,000 pupils, a school would receive £8 million a year. In London, a school of the same size would receive £12 million a year, so 33% difference in funding. What is your assessment, Secretary of State, of how the national funding formula currently works, and what plans do you have for its future?
This is a complex area in terms of were there to be any change into how you get that right. The funding that we have allocated this year to schools was on the basis of the previous funding formula. That was necessary in order to make sure the money got out the door to schools. I hear from colleagues across the House who present different challenges in different areas. It would be, I'll be frank, it will be impossible to find a system that delivers what everyone wants all of the time in every area. And I appreciate that often what people want is more money into the school system. And of course, we are investing more, but this does remain a challenge. We are looking at this area, what the mechanism might be for determining school funding into the future. That work is underway. I can't give you a timescale owing to the complexity of it. But we will, of course, take account of specific examples that constituency MPs will offer in order to understand what a different system might look like into the future.
Obviously, everybody's not going to get everything on their wish list all over the country, and there are lots of different demands. But it would appear that a bit more equity across the piece, I would assume, would be something you would like to see.
We of course want to make sure that we've got a fair and consistent formula that delivers for all communities, with of course I think a focus on making sure that we are targeting often quite scarce resource where it will make the biggest difference.
Just if the committee will allow me to just develop that. I mean, I think the national funding formula has been a really important shift towards a system where it is transparent and clear why schools are funded as they are. So before the funding formula, you had a wide range of different arrangements in different authorities and a lot of historic differences in funding. We are now at the place where you can explain the differences in school funding based on the characteristics of pupils and the size and shape of schools, and the debate tends to be principally about people's views about how much different characteristics should be weighted. So that I think it's worth saying that difference between schools in your constituency and schools in London will be about the composition of the pupils and a cost weighting for London, and that is a real advance from a phase in which it was impossible to describe why there were differences between different schools. And I think but both under the instruction of ministers and as officials, we will always try to make sure we are clear about kind of making sure we've got the best and most up-to-date evidence base on how we balance those factors, and we will always listen to people. But I do think it's worth saying a child with the same characteristics now in different areas of the country is funded at the same level in different places through the national funding formula, and that's a quite important principle to retain, I think.
Thank you. So recent estimates from the IFS indicate that growth in per pupil funding in 25-26, 2.8% in cash terms, will not cover the expected increase in school costs. And we know that some councils are asking to take money away from schools to secure the safety valve funding. In Devon, they're talking about 0.5%. If this is done, schools will be 0.9% worse off under this government than under the previous government, which I'm sure is not something you would like to see. So what is the department's plan to address this gap in funding?
At the budget, even when you take account of the very constrained fiscal environment, the Chancellor did seek to protect key education priorities. That's why we did invest an additional £2.3 billion into schools, of which £1 billion was support for children with SEND. But I do recognise the pressures that schools are under. I would also just add that the analysis from the IFS, for example, in this area does take account of the pressures that high needs and SEND are having on the education sector. I think that underlines the need for reform. The reason we want to drive reform is not because we want to bear down on cost, but I think when you look at the trajectory in terms of the financial sustainability challenges it presents, it demonstrates the need to do things differently. I think, alongside that, we did see today a slight dip in inflation. We know that there is more to do in order to stabilise the economy. That, of course, will feed through into schools' projections and planning. But I know it's tight for lots of schools. I appreciate they remain under considerable pressure. We have invested more, but there are wider challenges right across the public sector, and of course the Chancellor has to take decisions about how these can be managed right across the board.
Thank you. Darren.
Thank you. Secretary of State, the condition of school buildings, certainly in my constituency and across the country, was a source of huge concern under the last Parliament. We had the RAC crisis. What funding there was limited, and my experience was certainly that tended to be more readily available to preferred models of school rather than all schools. So my questions are, do you plan to change that approach? And if so, what is your plan to address the continued poor state of many schools around the country?
Yeah. I agree that there remain big and long-standing challenges in terms of the schools estate overall. We, of course, more recently had the crisis around RAC, and I'll bring in the Permanent Secretary in a moment on that, if I may, just given that this is an issue that covers kind of both administrations. I think RAC, however, shone a light on what is clearly a wider challenge across our schools and college estate, where you increasingly see schools that are way beyond their design life. And I believe that children should have the right to be in really first-class accommodation and provision, and the difference that makes. We are investing more through the budget in schools capital. We also are investing more in capital support for colleges, the first time since reclassification of our colleges. But there is more, of course, that we will need to do. This is a challenge in the wider context. It's why the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is looking at kind of the infrastructure plan across government, because I think the argument that I would make around investment in schools capital is, yes, it's about children's life chances, because we know the difference it can make to have really fantastic facilities. But all of us will have seen the difference it makes in terms of construction jobs, skills, local growth and opportunities. And given the challenges that we face around, I think particularly apprenticeship starts for our young people in key sectors like construction, school rebuilding programmes, public sector investment can be a real spur for private sector growth and job opportunities as well. And if I may, I'll just pass to the Permanent Secretary on the kind of RAC side of things, and just to give a brief update on where we are on that.
Really happy to do that. So I think the first thing to say is that we got to the stage partway through last year where we had either structural mitigations or temporary buildings in place, so that very rapidly we got to the place where there was no child being educated under a RAC roof, and we then got to the place where every school had in place a good medium-term solution that meant that they could educate children well, and we had good feedback from school leaders on the support that they got. We then announced the long-term RAC removal route for every school that had RAC identified. For 113 of those schools and colleges, that was through grant funding. In other words, the school made a set of proposals, we gave them the grant, and it's for them then to take the work forward. In general, it makes sense for schools to do significant building works in holiday periods, and for quite a lot of those schools, when they looked at the plan, they chose to do that this coming summer rather than last summer. So we have got about a third of those have already fully removed the RAC from their school. Most of the remainder will be seeking to do that this summer. And then for 123 schools and colleges, our assessment was that it was better value for money and more sensible to put the school into the school rebuilding programme rather than to do a separate RAC removal. And that by its nature takes a little bit longer, but all of those schools are now allocated to one of the 3 school rebuilding programme delivery groups, and the first group are projects which will commence planning and feasibility work between April 2023 and March 2025. The beginning of that period's in the past. The eagle-eyed will spot, and so we have got 41 of those projects already into feasibility and underway. But I think it's worth saying in all of those schools there's a good quality medium-term solution in place, so they're not sitting in sort of, with bits of sort of red and white strip around them. They're in a good quality temporary solution while we do that work on the rebuilding programme.
Thank you, Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, child poverty has increased massively, with over 4 million children living in poverty, and we also have seen an increase of children in poverty living in larger families of 3 or more children, and you co-chair the government's child poverty task force. Will you look at the impact of the 2-child benefit cap first, and then we also want to know when exactly will the child poverty strategy be published, and what education provisions can we expect?
We will consider every area where we believe we can bear down on the numbers of children living in poverty, and that does extend to questions around the shape and nature of the social security system, absolutely. Notwithstanding the fact that there are real and serious challenges across the public finances. We intend to report in the spring. We set this up, the Prime Minister set this up urgently when we formed the government. We met for the very first time in August. As you say, I co-chair the task force with the Work and Pensions Secretary. That's because we recognise that whilst there are questions that relate to the Department for Work and Pensions and to questions of social security, there are wider questions I think we have to address as a society about how we have ended up with so many children growing up in poverty. So that is about how we can increase parents' incomes, how we can bear down on the costs that families are facing, and what action is required right across government in order to do that. I do think it is a stain on our society that so many children are growing up in poverty. There's a moral imperative to take action on that, and we absolutely take on that responsibility. But coming back to education, we know that this has a really serious and damaging impact on children's education, on their life chances. I hear from far too many teachers and school staff that they are, amazingly, because they're wonderful people, stepping in to provide food, washing clothes, helping families who are in temporary accommodation. The cases, you know, the families that I've met through this work, through fantastic third sector organisations where, you know, the reason they're struggling to get their children to school on time is because they're having to travel an hour and a half every day on a bus across a city because they're living in a B&B, and that is just not good enough for children in this day and age to not have kind of good, you know, living conditions, to have access to a kitchen, a bedroom, a safe place, a quiet place to do their homework. This has serious and damaging impacts right across children's lives. We are committed to taking action on this area, and I do look forward to setting out with the Work and Pension Secretary what we intend to do right across government, because yes, this is the Department for Education and the Department for Work and Pensions. There is also the work of so many other government departments in this area. And just very briefly, the work that we had done so far, yes, has involved the work across government in terms of the ministerial task force. It's also involved drawing on a very wide range of experts from a range, not just our fantastic charities and others, but from business, from energy providers, on skills, childcare. So hearing from a range of experts about what they believe we need to be thinking about to really make a step change in this area, changing the fundamentals so that all children across our country have a really happy and safe childhood and don't experience what I believe to be avoidable poverty.
The difference in educational outcomes between children and young people from less and more affluent backgrounds is reported to be at its greatest level for more than a decade, and that's another really concerning development. So how do you intend to reverse this?
It's a profound challenge, and we do see growing evidence about the disadvantage gap that is opening up at a range of levels during a child's education. So there is action that is required in the here and now for children who are currently going through the school system. I think much of that is around workforce. It's about the work of the Child Poverty Task Force. I would say in addition to that, all of the evidence is so clear that what happens in the first 5 years of a child's life makes such a profound difference to what happens by the time they leave school at the age of 16. It's why through our plan for change we have prioritised making sure that more children than ever reach a good level of development by the age of 5, because we know in terms of the evidence base that if they fail to reach that good level, it has a lifelong impact, not just at what they're able to achieve at the age of 16, but also the profound impact it has on their earnings right throughout their life too. So we are focusing much of our efforts on expanding the childcare entitlement to make sure that families have access to high quality early years provision, but that wider support that all families need. Becoming a parent for the first time is a wonderful and profound moment, but all parents experience challenge and difficulty, and how we ensure that right across the country all families have access to really good family help, early support, and again, not just the work of the Department for Education, the work of colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care around maternity support, around health access to health visiting, and that takes us back to children with SEND and I would say early identification of need alongside that.
The last government was shamed by Marcus Rashford into acting on holiday hunger for the poorest children, and out of that came the Holiday Activities and Fun programme. Are you planning to sustain that programme?
We're going through a process at the moment in the department of looking at all areas of spend. That is very challenging, even with the prioritisation of the Chancellor as part of that budget process. But I do recognise the enormous value that the programme has provided and the difference that it's made to children's lives.
When will there be clarity on that? I mean, I'm just asking partly as a constituency MP, where we've seen the huge benefits from that programme, and I've got local providers who are sort of desperate to know whether they will have the funding to be able to continue for the Easter holidays and beyond.
We're working through it as quickly as we can. We know that councils want clarity on this. We will set it out as quickly as we can at the earliest opportunity, but I am alive to the challenge that you present and the need for certainty in this area.
Thank you. Jess?
We know that 1 in 5 children has a diagnosable mental health disorder, and that services are really struggling to support these children. Labour's manifesto promised a mental health professional in every school. What steps are being taken to make this a reality? And is the department still on track to have 50% of schools with mental health support teams by the end of March 2025?
We're working as quickly as we can on this because I do recognise the challenge at the moment around support for children's mental health, around well-being, the levels of unhappiness that so many of our children experience, where we are internationally not in good shape if we want to look at what that means for our children here. We are working with colleagues across health on how we roll this out. They continue to roll out in schools and colleges across the country, as you say. The expectation is that we'll cover 50% of pupils by the end of March this year. But we're working closely with colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care on how we deliver on that commitment, because I think it is absolutely essential that young people have access to high quality mental health provision. What we want to make sure alongside that, however, is that there is a clear relationship between in-school provision and how that connects to wider ongoing mental health support, where the challenge might be greater in terms of the need for ongoing more specialist support. So making sure that alignment is right, and I think the mental health support teams have shown a good way to join that together.
Just going to confirm we are on track for the 50%.
Thank you. Caroline?
Thank you. So the previous government published guidance on prohibiting the use of mobile phones in schools, but they stopped short of an outright ban. Given the sort of rising evidence we're seeing about the harm that mobile phones are causing to children and young people, do you support a ban on mobile phones in schools?
I think all parents worry about access to social media around technology. I will respond to the very precise point that you ask. I think there is some of the wider responsibilities across government are not simply mine alone, but I think there is a question particularly around technology and young people about how we equip them for the world to come in that online space. And I think technology, there are some really great ways in which I think technology, particularly within our school system, can drive innovation. But on the precise question on mobile phone use within schools, my belief is that the guidance that we have in place at the moment is being followed by schools, that they are making sure that use of mobile phones is not damaging children's learning. Many of the questions that arise from mobile phone use, sadly, arise after the school day has ended, around the impact of sometimes of bullying and of terrible behaviour that we see arising out of it.
I was only going to add, so the guidance that was published and that is still enforced prohibits the use of mobile phones in schools throughout the school day, including during lessons, but also the time between lessons and break times and lunch times. Some of the conversations about where you might go further are around. So again, we know school leaders implement that in different ways, and some of the conversations have been about the difference between, for example, policies that require children to keep the phone away versus those that literally prohibit it from coming into school. And the implementation of that is really linked to a whole set of other practicalities around the running of the school. And again, we do tend to start from the principle that we should let heads and teachers run their schools. And so I think there's two questions. So there's real clarity about the fact that we think it's important that the school day is a phone-free time for children. How a school chooses to implement that, we think should be left up to schools. We continue to work with schools and school leaders on the practicalities of how that works, and we'll keep listening and learning on it. But I think it's important to up to them.
And are you considering further controls on social media use for children and other ways of protecting them from online harm?
We do want to keep this area under review. You'll appreciate that this drifts slightly beyond my responsibilities. So there's obviously clearly, as you've described there, a connection between schools, for which I'm responsible, and the wider the wider issues around social media use and access to unsuitable material online. This is something across government that we're keeping under review in light of emerging international evidence and approaches.
Caroline Johnson, you wanted to come in on that?
Thank you. I've got two questions if I can, Chair. The first was just going back to what I was saying earlier about children moving schools mid-term and children's getting disrupted mid-year. You've talked quite powerfully about this being about every child in the country and your responsibility for every child, and that's really good to hear. So some children have found themselves having to leave schools because of the VAT or for other reasons, or they've had changes in the Latin programme. How are you making sure that children, particularly in exam years, who may be only maybe in the middle of their mocks, just weeks really from now from their final exams that may govern the university futures that they get, how are you making sure, what support have you put in place to ensure that those children who may be moving into a school that doesn't have the same course or hasn't studied the same books in English or history, the same periods of history, are getting to do their exam without being disrupted, without being to detriment, essentially because their parents don't have the money that they need to continue their education?
So private schools, as private institutions, are responsible for determining what they charge parents, the level of fee that they apply, and they have flexibility as to how.
Wasn't the question so?
Well, I'm answering the question, which is to say that they are able to make decisions about how they ask of parents by way of contribution. If they believe there to be cases where that might be a challenge in the way that you have described, then of course those schools, as institutions that can make decisions around their own budgets, around planning and levels of fees that they set, can determine whether they are able to put in place additional support for such children. Private schools have, as I said, over an extended period of time, inflated their fees considerably. They have gone up in a very, very significant fashion. I would also just say that this was a clear manifesto commitment that we made. We were clear for some years that it was our intention to introduce this policy. And of course, private schools, like all businesses, are able to consider how they absorb cost, what costs they pass on, the level of service that they provide, and what that means for the fees that they charge to parents. So ultimately, I think the responsibility rests with private schools as to the decisions that they make as independent institutions.
Sorry, if I could bring you back to the question, please. The question was, there will be schools whose fees are set at a set level, whose parents cannot afford them level anymore. Okay, those children may have to leave those schools as a result. These are children, whatever choices their parents have, however affluent their parents may be, these are children who are in a key part of their educational career. So where those children are back in the state sector under her responsibility to educate, what support is she putting in place to make sure that children who are in the middle of exam periods with specific subjects and exam boards that they've studied for are able to continue and achieve the best that they possibly can in the exams that may be only weeks away? That was the question.
Yes, and the answer is that my expectation is that private schools who are able to make decisions about how they support pupils and families within their institution are able to make decisions about how they might put in place that support. But I think just to the wider point around the numbers and the movement in terms of what we anticipate, the numbers are very small in the context of the wider school system.
I was just going to add two things. So the first is that the work that we're doing with independent schools suggests that the vast majority have put measures in place to support children who might be otherwise need to move at such critical moments. And the second thing to say is that when we think about the receiving school, and as the Secretary of State says, our impact assessment suggests the numbers will be extremely small. Across the state system, schools are accustomed to managing pupil movement in year, including at difficult times. So if you think about children at the other end of the income spectrum, instability in housing and other difficulties means that they are significantly more likely to have to move at moments of educational difficulty and pressure. And the state system, and again, those of you who have been involved in teaching in the state system will know this, will work incredibly hard with a received child who has had to move during a GCSE period, will, again, and this is not a new phenomenon for those children at the other end of the social spectrum.
Right.
So schools have a set of means, techniques and methods that they will use to make sure they understand, for example, what syllabus a child has been studying if it's changed, and to work with them closely to support that. So I think it's really important that we think thoughtfully and that we are sympathetic to the situation of every individual child, as you say, but again that we remember that movement and difficulty caused by financial pressure is still very predominantly something that is more frequently experienced by children at the bottom end of the social scale than at the top.
Thank you for the answer to the question. Thank you, I appreciate that. My second question was about degree apprenticeships. The degree apprenticeships offer young people the opportunity to learn and work at the same time, which can be a financially advantageous as well as a educationally advantageous programme. Does the Secretary of State support the principle of degree apprenticeship, and does she intend to expand it?
I think degree apprenticeships provide a fantastic route for young people. We want to make sure that there are more of them. I want more apprenticeship starts right across the board. I think there is particularly a challenge alongside degree apprenticeships in level 2 and level 3 apprenticeship starts at the moment, where not enough young people are getting the chance that they deserve. So yes, absolutely, more degree level apprenticeships. I would just add in addition, however, I want to make sure that they are an option that is available to the widest possible range of young people. I think, sadly, at the moment, there is still often a lack of knowledge and awareness as to the availability of such opportunities, and we need to make sure that there is wide understanding and that young people from a range of backgrounds are able to take up those opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amanda.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum, which is early years, but it's something we know that if we get it right, it has the best outcomes for young people. And I've heard from my own constituency, both settings and the employees within them, that despite the increase in entitlement to free early years provision, the early years sector is facing considerable challenge in terms of funding and workforce and capacity. The IFS, so the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has said that your recent funding uplift for local authority core hour funding rates for early years providers will not offset the increases in the minimum wage and national insurance. So firstly, is the funding uplift adequate, and what else are you doing to support this sector and ensure high quality early years provision is accessible for all?
Absolutely. I've been clear that this is my single biggest priority because it is where we make the single biggest difference to children's life chances. It's how we set them up to succeed. And it is central to our mission of giving every child the best start in life. It's why, as part of the plan for change, we had that focus on a record number of children reaching a good level of development at the end of the early years foundation stage assessment. And in order to do that, having access to high quality early years provision is crucial. I think there's a few elements to that, if I may, Chair. Around workforce, yes, we need to ensure that we have a well-supported, well-trained workforce. We are seeking to grow the number of people working in early years settings. It is a brilliant place to work, a fantastic place to work, but we know that there is more to do to align early years with the school system, in particular around pedagogy, around development, around quality of teaching and care within the setting. There is also a big challenge around places where they are in the country, access to parents. That's why we launched very early on and will announce this year the first phase of primary-based nursery, so to use some of that spare capacity that we talked about earlier to create more high-quality provision within schools. There is further that we need to do in order to build up existing settings, but for many parents, the chance where they have a number of children within a school, the chance to access that nursery provision alongside the wider school is so crucial, particularly in transition points and particularly for some of our most disadvantaged families. I do understand the need to support providers at this point. It's why we did announce further plans around the expansion grant, which will focus on increasing the early years pupil premium, which will increase by over 45%. This is the equivalent of up to £570 per eligible child per year. That rate had stayed flat for many years. This was the single biggest increase in the early years pupil premium to respond to the pressures and challenges around places, to support providers, to create more provision for disadvantaged families, but also to give, I think, what is a much needed boost to the sector overall.
Thank you. The IFS describe the government's funding announcement as only a fairly small nudge in the right direction towards the plan for change goal of 75% of 5-year-olds achieving a good level of development by 2028. What else needs to be done to achieve that goal?
Yes. So through the budget, we announced over £8 billion by way of financial support towards the entitlements around early years education and care. That's obviously a crucial part of this. But alongside that, it's also around early family support as well. So yes, it's about the formal offer that we give to children and families, but it's also about, and we have work underway in this area, how we expand more family support services across our country, bring together those services, working with families to deliver better life chances. I think the challenge and the opportunity that comes of the system that we have now is that by the time the rollout has concluded, 80% of childcare costs in this country will be taxpayer backed. Now that is an enormous amount of money. It's welcome and much needed, but I think we do really need to think seriously about whether we are getting the best possible outcomes from that investment. We would certainly not, if we were to start afresh, design a system that is engineered in this way. And that's part of the wider long-term reform that we're thinking about, both in terms of the workforce, the provision, and how funding delivers for families as well.
And there's been, just on school-based, primary school-based nurseries, there's been some analysis that shows that the areas of the country where there is capacity in schools to deliver school-based nurseries may not entirely match up with the areas in the country where there are childcare deserts. And combining that with a policy for the rollout which favours working households, how are you going to make sure that children who happen to be born into a household where parents aren't working, who are often the poorest children in the country, where we know that high quality early years education can make the very biggest difference, aren't left behind?
There is a question about take-up, including in even among some parents who might be eligible, in terms of a reluctance or perhaps the lack of places that are available that therefore are not able to take up what they might be entitled to. But I think it's the early years entitlements are crucial, and we know that it makes a big difference to children's life chances. But we also know that all of the evidence points to really joined up family support services alongside that, because not all parents will decide that formal childcare, be that through a provider, a school, or another setting, is what they want. Perhaps if they have a number of children, that might not be the option that they would choose. They might prefer for their child to remain at home with them for a longer period. In that case, I think we need to consider what the wider offer is for all families and children. So bringing together those services alongside the entitlements. I do recognise the cliff edges that are there, some of the challenges that are there within the current system. We are looking at that. It is complicated. The fiscal situation is difficult. But I do recognise that it is through some of those options around early education and entitlements that we can see the biggest goals, and it's how we can, alongside the reform that we want to bring in our school system, deliver better life chances for children and better outcomes by the end of primary school.
Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to higher education, I know you're very alive to the challenge of higher education funding, and you announced the measure to remove the freeze on fees. Even taking into account that measure, the Office for Students has warned that 3/4 of universities and other higher education settings could be in financial deficit within the next year. So what comes next in terms of your action to deal with university funding?
I do recognise that the higher education sector does need a secure financial footing, and the pressures that many institutions are under at the moment. That's why I took the difficult but necessary decision to make the announcement last year around changes in funding in order to provide more investment into the sector, but also some certainty for the sector, which has been lacking for a long time. Through the reforms that we have also undertaken of the Office for Students, there has been a much sharper focus on financial sustainability of institutions. Sir David Behan's report, begun under the last government, was crucial. He is now, as an interim chair, leading the work of the organisation to have a much clearer focus on identifying problems sooner. as to the longer term direction, throughout this year we will be engaged in a process of reform, working with institutions, with providers, in order to deliver a better system, because our universities are world leading. They are beacons around the world. It's why so many students from different parts of the world choose to come here to study at our fantastic institutions, and they make such a profound difference to towns and cities across our country, including in their economic contribution. My observation would be that for too long they were a political football rather than recognised as being the public good that they are. I think there is more that we can ask of the sector, particularly where it comes to alignment around growth and around local economies, and what more they can do to join together, particularly with further education, to provide opportunities right throughout people's lives to take on education, training and skills. And that speaks to the wider reform across the system of skills training around the apprenticeship levy, and how we can really involve employers in some of that where it's more closely aligned with local and regional economies.
Thank you. I probably should have declared the interest that I worked in a university for 20 years, but appreciate your answers on that. You were very clear with universities when you removed the fee freeze that you expected more in terms of widening participation and other measures, and that more would come. As part of that reform, can you set out a bit more detail about what that expectation is going to consist of, how you're going to monitor that, what it will look like for the sector?
We do expect to see more where it comes to widening participation and access. Now, just to set out what I mean when I say that, yes, it's about university being an option for all young people who have what is necessary to go on to take up that opportunity. But it's also about rates of completion amongst young people too. It's one thing to support young people to get in through the door, it's another to make sure that they have a brilliant experience at university and are able to complete their studies, and that is particularly a challenge often for young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. There are also areas where I think we could do a lot more and ask a lot more of the sector. So for example, care experienced young people, those coming through the care system, making sure that institutions are doing a lot more to support what can be a different set of circumstances to your average 18-year-old with family backing. So that's a part of it. And my challenge to the sector is there is good practice that's out there. I've seen some great examples of work in this area, but they are leading experts in evidence and in research. Share that, work together, spread that across the system, and avoid duplication, because often there can be duplication in some of the work in this area that is underway, and to take it really seriously.
Finally, when do you expect to have that kind of package of expectations ready and in some kind of format to share with us and with the sector?
We're engaging with the sector and with others, with business, with students, with the Office for Students on what this will look like. It's a big piece of work that we have underway around that wider reform, and we'll continue to keep the House updated in this area. I don't know if you're able to say a little bit more about